In the small town of Crestwood, located in the heart of the Midwest, there was a highway that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a place where nothing much happened, where life flowed slowly and measuredly. But one fateful night, everything changed for a young woman named Sarah. Sarah was 20 years old and had just made the 8-hour journey home after visiting friends. Everything was going well until it went completely dark. Unable to book a hotel for the night, Sarah found herself on a deserted highway, and her sense of loneliness grew with each passing minute. As the clock ticked past 11 o'clock in the evening, Sarah began to feel anxious. She looked in the rearview mirror and noticed a car behind her. It was an unremarkable sedan, and she didn't pay much attention to it at first. They're just hitchhikers, she thought. But as the minutes turned into hours and she continued driving down the lonely road, the same car remained in her rearview mirror. At first, Sarah thought it was a mere coincidence. Maybe they're going in the same direction, she thought. But as the kilometers passed and the car stubbornly remained behind, doubts began to gnaw at her. Tension reached its peak when Sarah decided to make a stop at a dimly lit gas station. She pulled into the lot, parked at the pumps and went inside to buy an energy drink. As she stood in line, she looked out the window and saw a sedan parked on the other side of the road. The headlights were on, but the driver made no move to get out of the car. Anxiety dropped heavy on Sarah's shoulders and she quickly paid for her drink and left the store. As soon as she got back into the car, the mysterious sedan pulled away and took its place behind her again. Sarah's heart raced as she continued to drive down the deserted highway. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that some unseen threat was following her. She decided to test her suspicions and pulled over to a random side road. The sedan stopped on the opposite side of the road, keeping its headlights on and hiding the driver in the shadows. Fear gripped Sarah. She had to make sure she wasn't just being paranoid. She continued driving and the car followed her again. This chilling game of cat and mouse continued for another hour, and every pull-off and stop was followed by the appearance of the ominous sedan. Despair gripped Sarah when she realized she was only 2 hours away from her hometown. She dialed her parents' number and explained the alarming situation unfolding behind her back. Her parents' voices trembling with excitement advised her to drive to the center of town and turn left 4 times. With trembling hands, Sarah followed their instructions, praying that this strange chase would finally end. But the sedan continued to follow her relentlessly, never straying a step from its relentless goal. Her parents, furious, ordered her to drive straight to the police station. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled up to the police station. The sedan stayed on her tail until the very last moment. As she turned into the police station parking lot, the sedan suddenly took off, picked up speed, and sped away. Relief and terror mixed in Sarah's veins as she watched the sedan disappear into the distance. She parked the car and hurried to the police station to tell them what had happened. The officers listened to her carefully, concern written on their faces. They immediately dispatched a patrol car to search for the mysterious stalker. Days passed into weeks, and Sarah still had no word from the police. The unknown driver remained a shadow of a mystery and his motives a chilling mystery. Sarah had no answers, but the horror of that night remained in her memory. Since that day, Sarah couldn't help but be extra vigilant whenever she noticed a car behind her, especially one that was turning in the same direction as her. She was now in a constant state of tension on once calm stretches of highway, and could no longer escape the feeling that the unknown stalker might one day return. In the quiet, sleepy town of Maplewood, located in upstate New York, life flowed predictably. Here, people left their doors unlocked, children played freely in the streets, and the occasional speeding ticket was the main concern. One of Maplewood's residents was Emily Davis, a young woman in her 20s with a heart full of dreams. She lived a simple life, working as a waitress at the local diner, and her days were filled with the routine of small-town life. But Emily's adventurous soul always yearned for something more, to explore the world beyond the hills. One crisp fall evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily's thirst for adventure prompted her to hit the road. She got into her trusty old Toyota and set off on a journey through winding roads crisscrossing the beautiful countryside. As Emily drove farther away from the city, the neighborhoods became more and more remote. The thick trees that lined the road cast eerie shadows in the thickening dusk. The sparse rustling of leaves in the wind sent shivers down her spine. She realized she had wandered into secluded corners, far from familiar faces. At that moment, Emily noticed the bright flashing headlights of a police car approaching from behind. The car was marked, its blue and red lights pulsing ominously. Emily instinctively braced herself against the curb, her heart racing with excitement. The officer, a heavy-set middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, approached Emily's car. He asked for her license and registration, and his voice sounded commanding. Emily complied, handing over her papers while feeling a growing unease. The officer studied her papers for a moment and then leaned closer, invading her personal space. Emily felt his hot breath on her neck, and alarm bells rang in her head. Echoes of horrifying events rang in her head, and she realized she had to be careful. "Step out of the car, please," the officer ordered, looking around to make sure no one was watching them. Panic rose up inside Emily, but she didn't move from her seat. Instead, she calmly asked the officer, "Could you please call for backup? It's getting late, and I'm not comfortable getting out of my car in this remote area." The expression on the officer's face wavered for a moment, his intentions unclear. Emily's heart raced, but she stayed where she was. That's when she remembered the advice she'd heard from her friend to never stop a car in a secluded area at night. With trembling hands, Emily turned on the emergency lights, pulled out her cell phone, and dialed 911. During the call, she discreetly put the phone to her ear, keeping her eyes on the officer. The dispatcher's voice became a lifeline for her. Emily explained the situation, her voice shaking with fear. The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way and she could stay on the line until it arrived. The officer, clearly alarmed, retreated to his car, keeping his eyes on Emily. A few minutes later, a second car pulled up and two uniformed officers approached the scene. They took control of the situation and began questioning the officer who had stopped Emily. It became clear that something was amiss, and the situation quickly escalated. It turned out that the officer who had stopped Emily was an imposter, a criminal who had taken advantage of people's trust in law enforcement. He, like Emily, was preying on vulnerable victims in remote areas. In the end, Emily's quick thinking and the unwavering support of the dispatcher saved her from a sinister fate. The self-appointed officer was arrested and eventually stood trial for his crimes. In an Ondam town nestled among the rolling hills of the Midwest, there lived a young man named Daniel Reynolds. It was the 1980s, and Daniel had recently obtained his driver's license, which meant he was gaining his freedom. With an unruly mop of brown hair and a penchant for wearing aviator sunglasses, he was the epitome of youthful enthusiasm. Little did he know that one fateful day would change his life forever. It happened on a warm and sunny afternoon in late July. Daniel, eager to explore the world outside of his town, decided to take an independent trip to a neighboring town. He got into his modest powder blue sedan, which he affectionately called Bluebird, and drove onto the busy freeway. Driving down the highway, with the windows down and music playing on the radio, Daniel felt the anxiety of inexperience overwhelm him. He had missed his exit and had to change lanes quickly to make it in time. In his haste, he failed to notice a car in his blind spot and, swerving sharply, accidentally clipped a fellow driver. Not realizing the seriousness of his mistake, Daniel continued on the freeway until the next traffic light. He was shocked, but had already forgotten what had happened. Then he noticed a car coming up behind him, its engine rumbling menacingly. Daniel looked at the car in the rearview mirror and thought he recognized it. He couldn't believe his luck. It was the same car his high school friend Mark drove. A sense of relief swept over him when he thought it was Mark, coming to laugh at a traffic mishap. However, when the car door swung open behind him, the feeling of relief was instantly replaced by fear. It wasn't Mark, but a stranger, a tall and imposing man with a grim expression. He approached Daniel's car with the tire iron in his hands, his eyes full of rage. In a panic, Daniel tried to open the car door, but he had no time to react before the stranger yanked him out of the car with an iron grip. Time seemed to slow down as the first blow rang out and pain exploded in Daniel's head as he fell to the ground, drenching it in his own blood. The stranger continued to shower Daniel with blows, and cars drove by. Oblivious to the horror unfolding, the world became a blur of pain, and Daniel's consciousness began to slip away. Eventually, a passing motorist called emergency services. and an ambulance arrived and took Daniel to a nearby hospital. Medics worked tirelessly to save him, but his injuries were very serious. Daniel had to endure several grueling surgeries to repair his face, and the injury caused significant brain damage. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, Daniel's life changed irrevocably. He was forced to move in with his parents, and his once promising future was forever changed. The scars on his face were a constant reminder of that fateful day on the freeway, and his head injury kept him on his toes. He suffered memory loss and cognitive impairment. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, the stranger who attacked Daniel was never apprehended. He remained a shadowy figure lurking in the depths of Daniel's nightmares. In a quiet town there was a prison complex. It was a place where hardened criminals were held. The prison was the epitome of hopelessness, and I, Jacob Hargrove, was one of the unfortunate few who worked as a correctional officer on the dreaded third shift. Every night I donned my uniform and prepared to enter that grim world of steel bars and echoing screams. But one fateful morning, a story happened that would forever be imprinted in my dreams. The clock struck 6 in the morning and my shift was finally over. Exhausted and longing for the warmth of my own bed, I walked out of the prison gates into the cool pre-dawn darkness. The small town and the roads leading away from the prison were deserted at this hour. I made my way through the empty streets, feeling the taste of freedom on my lips. After passing a few main streets, I approached the country highway that signified the last leg of my journey home. It was a difficult curve, known for large semi-trucks rumbling through it, forcing caution. However, the road was unusually quiet that morning, and I approached the intersection with a sense of relief. Stopping at a sign, I looked to my right, preparing to turn onto the highway. Just then I saw it. A van was turning off the highway, heading toward me. The driver and I met eyes, and the world around me seemed to blur. Time seemed to stop as I stared at the man in the driver's seat. I could swear on the graves of both my parents that what I was seeing was not a real person, and it wasn't about ugliness or disability. No, this man looked fundamentally wrong, unnatural, twisted, and evil. There was a sinister quality to his face, a darkness beyond any description. His eyes, those piercing, malevolent eyes, stared at me with such intensity that a shiver ran down my spine. It seemed he could look into the depths of my soul, unravel all the secrets, all the fears, all the hidden darkness I had ever known. In that moment, a deep sense of horror swept over me, a sense of pure evil that seemed to penetrate my very gut. The moment his gaze stopped on me, an uncontrollable nausea swept through my body. A wave of nausea swept over me, and I felt bile rising in my throat. Panic gripped me, and I realized I had to get away from this evil presence as soon as possible. I pressed down on the gas pedal, turned onto the highway, and left the van behind. The world outside the car was blaring, my heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing with questions. What had I just witnessed? Who was this man? And, most importantly, was it possible to encounter a physical manifestation of evil? Minutes passed like hours. I was rushing toward home, and the image of that evil driver burned in my mind. I could not escape the feeling that I had encountered something incomprehensible, dark and ancient. Finally, I reached the house and rushed inside. I was overwhelmed with the need to escape from this terrible encounter. I barely made it to the bathroom before the contents of my stomach poured down the toilet. The illness that had seized me began to pass, but the memory of that ominous encounter remained in my mind. To this day I am haunted by that morning, by the inexplicable evil I witnessed. I am not a superstitious person, nor am I overly religious, but I cannot deny what I saw. It was a chilling reminder that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension, forces that can seep into our reality and leave an indelible mark on those not fortunate enough to cross their path. An emergency trip to Mississippi was a whirlwind of stress and uncertainty. Claire and her husband David dropped everything and rushed to his mom's house to help her move into a nursing home. It was a long drive, especially since Claire didn't have a driver's license, so David had to take the whole trip. As they crossed the state line into the night, fatigue came over them like a heavy blanket. The road ahead seemed like an endless, black ribbon winding through the countryside. The absence of streetlights and the eerie silence of the early morning made the surroundings even more unsettling. Around 3 in the morning, Claire began to notice that something was wrong with David. Subtle signs, such as an altered breathing rhythm and demeanor, made her uneasy. They'd been married long enough for her to sense that something was wrong. "Honey, maybe you need to rest," Claire asked, feeling anxious. David's response was strangely nonchalant. "No, I'm fine. Let's just finish this stretch and then we'll find a hotel." Despite her concern, Claire trusted his judgment and decided to leave it at that for now. They continued to drive along this ominous stretch of road, the impenetrable darkness surrounding them like a shroud. Eventually, they reached the modest days inn and checked into a room, eager to get some rest. The morning sun shone through the curtains, awakening them from their slumber. As they stood side by side, brushing their teeth and preparing for the day ahead, Claire couldn't help but think of the creepy road the night before. "That stretch of road last night was so creepy," she said, shuddering at the memory. David's answer sent shivers down Claire's spine. He was silent for a moment, a detached expression in his eyes. Then he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Honestly, I thought I was dreaming. I remember it wasn't real, and I thought it was a dream." Claire couldn't hide the surprise in her voice when she reminded him. "I asked you if you needed a break and you said it was okay. You weren't like yourself." David nodded slowly, his expression hunted. "Yeah, I remember that too. And I thought I was dreaming it. Do me a favor and I'll return it if the need arises. If I ever tell you I'm fine and don't need a break after 4 hours of driving in pitch darkness, don't take no for an answer." I was so knocked out that I didn't even notice I was gone. His words hung in the air, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling of dread that swept over her. The realization that David had been completely dissociated on that dangerous stretch of road and his grip on reality was slipping away was deeply disturbing. Since that day, they had an agreement to stop each other long before they reached such a dangerous point of exhaustion. The thought of what might have happened haunted them both. It was a stark reminder that driving while exhausted is just as dangerous as driving drunk, and they were determined to never take that risk again. The summer after graduation, I took a temporary job at Silverwood State Park. By day, it was a quiet, peaceful place with sprawling forests and a clear lake shimmering in the sunlight. My shift started at 8 p.m. and lasted until 4 a.m. Working with me was Ranger Sarah, an experienced park ranger who had more than once encountered strange phenomena in the woods. On one such night, patrolling the park in her trusty truck, we were heading toward one of the boat docks, where the impenetrable darkness of the lake contrasted sharply with the twinkling stars overhead. The road was dimly lit by headlights, and the silence of the night was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Everything was calm, until a man appeared without warning from the dense bushes on the side of the road. His appearance was completely strange and unexpected. The man was wearing only underpants, which were uncomfortably tight around his body. In his hands he held a knife, swinging it wildly in the air like a sword. It was an unreal sight, and I couldn't help but exchange a puzzled look with Ranger Sarah. The man began to walk slowly toward our car. The ranger opened the window and leaned out and addressed the strange man with a note of concern in her voice. "Sir, do you need help?" she asked, shining her flashlight in his direction. The man appeared to be insane. He would not budge on a word we said. That's when I started honking as hard as I could. The man disappeared into the woods. Not expecting another surprise that would scare the hell out of us, we left immediately. To this day, we have no idea who it was or why he was attacking cars. The winding country road stretched out before me, shrouded in the blackness of night. I was making the familiar journey from my college, 4 hours away, to my hometown. These weekend trips were an opportunity for me to reconnect with my family, meet up with old high school friends, and take a break from the hustle and bustle of college life. My parents were divorced, but still lived in the same county. This weekend, I planned to stay at my mom's ranch house located deep in the countryside. I had just left a night of techno bowling with friends, the neon lights and crashing music still echoing in my head. As I drove alone through the desolate countryside, it was not uncommon to encounter empty roads. The night was quiet, with only the hum of my car's engine. The first hint of unease came when I noticed another car in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was a mere coincidence, just another traveler on this lonely stretch of road. But as the kilometers passed, my anxiety grew. The car behind me seemed to be watching my every move, coming closer and closer until it was uncomfortably close to my bumper. My heart raced as I looked back again and realized the driver was swerving erratically, coming dangerously close to my car. Panic gripped me as the realization came that this was no ordinary stalker. He wasn't going to let me pass or back up. I weighed my options, and the thought of stopping or pulling over terrified me. My head rattled, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began to trudge through the maze of country roads, desperate to break away from my relentless pursuer. But no matter how many turns I made, the car clung to me like a shadow in the night. Out of desperation, I hatched a risky plan. I decided to return to the town where I had spent the evening with friends. It was deep into the night, but the town was accessible by the state highway, which had now become a 3-lane highway. I decided that a well-lit road with the high speed limit and the presence of other cars might deter my pursuer. I pulled onto the highway, my heart pounding in my chest, and the mysterious car continued to follow me relentlessly, watching my every move. Anxiety gnawed at me as I drove mile after mile, the eerie silence of the dark highway broken only by the ghostly presence behind me. As the minutes dragged on, the panic grew. I felt trapped, my thoughts scrambling for a way out. And then, in a desperate attempt to get rid of my tormentor, I swerved out of the fast lane and onto the exit ramp at the last moment. The maneuver caught the car behind me by surprise, and it missed the exit, presumably having to pull onto the next one, located a few miles further down the road. With bated breath, I raced through the city streets in a reckless rush to get to my mom's house. I ignored the speed limit, pushing the car to the limit, driven by fear and adrenaline. Every pair of headlights behind me sent shivers down my spine and paranoia coursed through my veins. Finally, I pulled up to my mom's ranch house, and the car screeched to a halt on the gravel driveway. I jumped out of the car, shaking with relief and terror. Goosebumps crawled across my flesh, and even now, years later, I can't drive to my mom's house at night without the memories coming over me. To this day, I still don't know what the intentions of that car were or who was behind the wheel. I never saw her again, or at least didn't recognize her if I did. The city of Crestwood spread out beneath the night sky, its streets glimmering with the distant light of the metropolis. Barbara and her boyfriend, Mark, had established a cozy routine after his recent move and made the 45-minute drive from her house every weekend. Their route was simple, a winding drive on the freeway that took them through downtown and past the bustling airport. One fateful night, the clock struck 1 o'clock in the morning, and a thick silence hung over the highway, a stark contrast to the usual hustle and bustle. It was the perfect setting for a heartbreaking story that would haunt Barbara and Mark for many nights to come. As they drove past the airport runways and terminals, Barbara relaxed in the passenger seat, looking up at the stars twinkling overhead. The monotony of the straight highway put her in a light trance, and Mark seemed to be gripping the steering wheel tighter and tighter. Then, out of nowhere, a minivan appeared in the distance. At first, they didn't pay any attention to it. After all, there was a lot of traffic on this highway, cars appearing and disappearing. But as time passed, something happened. Their car seemed to synchronize with the minivan and they began to drive parallel to each other. Turning their gaze to his driver's window, something happened that they remembered for a long time. It was not the minibus itself that was alarming, but the person inside it. He was a gaunt, middle-aged figure with a grotesque expression. His eyes and mouth were wide open, creating a completely creepy expression that sent shivers down Barbara's spine. He seemed to be screaming with both his eyes and mouth at the same time, and his gaze was fixed on Barbara and Mark with an intensity that defied explanation. That gaze seemed to penetrate deep into their souls as a silent scream echoed in their minds. Barbara's heart was racing and she couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Her instincts screamed at her to turn away, to run away from this nightmarish sight. But she couldn't take her eyes off the man's face. Her pulse sped up, cold sweat beating on her forehead. Mark, sitting next to her, was just as frozen, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Their breathing became increasingly shallow as the seconds stretched on and the world around them turned into a picture of horror. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the van turned off the highway and disappeared into the night. Barbara and Mark exchanged looks of disbelief and horror, their voices shaking as they tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed. What was that? Barbara stuttered, her voice shaking. Mark answered in a similarly trembling voice. I have no idea, but I saw it too. That guy, his face, it was like something out of a nightmare. For the rest of the drive, there was a tense silence in the car, broken only by their attempts to rationalize what had happened. They debated whether to report it to the authorities, but ultimately decided against it. After all, the man in the van hadn't done anything threatening, just left behind a lingering sense of dread. When they finally arrived at Mark's new place of residence, they were haunted by the feeling that that night they had seen something otherworldly, unexplainable and haunting them in their dreams. The image of the man's face with eyes and mouth wide open in a terrible scream was forever imprinted in their minds. In the days and weeks that followed, Barbara and Mark tried to forget this strange encounter. They reassured themselves that it was just a strange, unexplained incident on a lonely stretch of highway. In the quiet town of Oak Ridge on a stormy night when I was just 18 years old, a gripping story of fear and survival unfolded. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of that night that has haunted me for over 2 decades. It was an ordinary Friday night when my best friend Emily, her younger sister Lily, and I decided to spend the night in a neighboring town. We spent a few hours laughing, dancing, and making memories we thought would last a lifetime. What we didn't know was that one memory would stay with us forever, not because of the joyful moments, but because of the horror it would cause. As the night drew to a close, the heavens opened and a torrential downpour began, turning the streets into rivers. We knew the road back to Oak Ridge would be treacherous, but staying in town was not an option. It was near midnight when we finally decided to weather the storm and head home. I sat in the front seat, Emily in the driver's seat, and Lily in the back seat. The windshield wipers whipped frantically as we drove down the dark, rain-wet highway. Visibility was terrible, and every passing car sent waves of water crashing against the windshield. It felt like we were driving in an endless storm. We drove for what seemed like an eternity. Our nerves were on edge. The rain kept pounding on the car. It was hard to see anything in the faint light of the headlights. The highway seemed eerily deserted, which added to our anxiety. As the situation worsened, Emily made the wise decision to pull over under an overpass. We hoped the thunderstorm would pass quickly and we could continue on our way in peace. I turned away to stare out the window. My breath fogged on the glass as Emily turned off the engine, plunging us into darkness. The rhythmic pounding of rain on the roof filled the silence inside the car. We exchanged nervous glances, our fantasies running wild in the impenetrable blackness. Distant rumblings of thunder intensified the sense of foreboding. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Suddenly a strange feeling came over me. Goosebumps ran down my neck. It was as if there was an invisible presence in the car with us, both disturbing and malevolent. I leaned closer to the window, trying to stare out into the steady downpour. And then I saw him, a dark figure in a hooded jacket, approaching our car with lightning speed. Panic swept over me, and I gasped in horror. My heart raced as I tried to start the car. Emily, a mask of terror frozen on her face, turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. The headlights pierced the darkness, revealing a hooded stranger a few inches from the car. Emily stepped on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, tires shrieking on the wet pavement. The hooded figure in our headlights drew back with a look of shock and anger on his face. We sped off into the stormy night, the rain pounding the windshield like icy daggers. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking on the dashboard. Emily navigated the winding highway with the skill of an experienced driver, her determination to get us to safety unwavering. For ages we drove in frightened silence, and memories of the hooded stranger lingered in our minds. We couldn't explain who they were or why they had attacked us. But one thing was certain, our lives were in grave danger that night. Finally, the storm began to subside, and we pulled into the familiar streets of Oak Ridge. The tension in the car began to ease as we pulled up to Emily's house, a refuge from the horrors of the night. We jumped out of the car, soaked to the bone, and hugged each other tightly, grateful that we had escaped. In the town of Millville, nestled deep in the countryside, life flowed at a relaxed pace. But on that eerie morning, as the sun cast long shadows over the quiet town. The tranquility was broken for one man, Jack Reynolds. Jack had just finished his night shift at the local mill. Exhausted and tired, he got into his old Chevrolet pickup truck, which had seen better days, and made the long drive home. It was one of those rare occasions when he took a road he rarely used because of its remoteness. With the steering wheel in his hands and the endless road stretching out before him, he longed for bed. Minutes turned into hours, and loneliness weighed on him. Jack's eyelids grew heavy, and the soft hum of the engine, like a lullaby, put him into a deep sleep. The radio was turned off for the entire trip, and the cabin was eerily silent. Just as Jack rested his chin on his chest and drifted into slumber, the unexplainable happened. A voice, loud and stern, came from the car speaker, breaking the silence in the cabin. "Right like rain," he commanded, sending electric shocks throughout Jack's body. Stunned and disoriented, Jack jerked awake, his heart pounding like a drum. The interior of the truck was dimly lit by the soft glow of the dashboard lights, but the world outside was plunged into darkness. He gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands, his knuckles white as he tried to regain his composure. Looking around, Jack couldn't believe his eyes. Instead of a familiar road, he was driving slowly across a vast open field. How had he ended up here? His thoughts were racing, desperately searching for an explanation. Panic grew inside him, clutching his chest. A voice spoke his name, Jack Reynolds. Goosebumps ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He fumbled with the controls on the dashboard, adjusting the sound, and toggled the radio on and off a few times. But it was all in vain. The radio remained stubbornly off. With trembling hands, Jack stared at the field outside the windshield. Moonlight flooded the landscape with an eerie silvery glow, casting long shadows. There were no signs of life, no other cars, no buildings, nothing but the vast grassy terrain. In a daze, Jack forced himself to focus. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. His mind told him this was some kind of strange dream, or perhaps he'd taken a wrong turn and was in unfamiliar territory. But in the back of his mind he knew that such an explanation could not account for the voice that had spoken his name so clearly. The night was dark and gloomy. I was driving on a deserted highway, and the hum of the engine was the lone soundtrack to the seemingly endless road ahead. The clock on the dashboard read 230 and the highway, once bustling with daytime traffic, now lay deserted save for a few sporadic cars. As I drove down the highway, 4 lanes stretched ahead, illuminated only by the soft glow of headlights. A short white cement dividing strip separated the two sides of the road, preventing oncoming traffic from colliding with me. It was the kind of highway where one feels both isolated and unprotected, like a lonely traveler in the night abyss. For some inexplicable reason, a sense of unease began to overwhelm me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Perhaps it was the eerie silence, the darkness that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Or perhaps it was just a figment of my overactive imagination. But then something unusual on the opposite side of the highway caught my eye. There, on the other side, a car stood on the curb. Its emergency lights flashed in the darkness like faint fireflies. I looked around curiously, wondering why someone would stop at this hour in such a deserted place. My heart sped up as I passed by, and then I saw it, a human figure, silhouetted against the dim lighting, running, hunched over as if fleeing from something or someone. They were moving with such speed that goosebumps ran down my spine. The person was right behind the trunk of a parked car and running in the opposite direction of traffic, toward my curb. My pulse quickened as I watched this surreal scene unfold before me. I couldn't take my eyes off the road, gripping the steering wheel tighter and tighter. The night seemed to hold its breath as the running figures approached my side of the road. They were running in the same direction as the stream of cars on my side, as if desperate to get away from someone. My heart pounded in my chest and terror filled every inch of my being. A few seconds later, as if materializing out of the shadows, another figure appeared behind the running man. It was a person, or at least it seemed so, but their movements were not ordinary at all. They held out their hands, fingers reaching for the runner, and I could see long, disheveled hair falling down his back. The moment the pursuer's hands made contact with the runner, I was struck with horror. They grabbed the runner with such force that it was impossible not to notice. The runner was yanked backward, his body contorted, and he was dragged with force back to the waiting car. The scene unfolded in a surreal blur of darkness and despair. The fleeing man's body twisted, his limbs dangling, trying to break free of his pursuer's grip. It was a brief but haunting sight that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't make out their faces or hear their voices over the roar of the highway, but the tension of the struggle was palpable even at a distance. It was as if I had stumbled into an underground exchange in the dark of night, a sinister ballet of desperation and malice. As I drifted away from this haunting scene, questions and fear swarmed in my mind. Who were these people? What had I just witnessed? It was a scene beyond explanation, a fragment of darkness forever imprinted in my memory. The highway stretched ahead, the desolation broken only by the eerie glow of headlights. It had been years, and I still blamed myself for not doing anything to help the fleeing man. In the heart of a remote forested area, far from the bustling city lights and conveniences of civilization, my life has always been marked by a sense of isolation. The place I called home was nestled among sprawling forests, an hour's drive from the nearest grocery store, in a quiet corner of the world where wildlife ruled. One crisp Christmas night, as I drove over a treacherous mountain pass, returning to my friend's house after a day spent with her family, the stars sparkled like diamonds in the black sky. Her home was even deeper in the wilderness, in a place that made my own seem almost urban. To reach her, one had to drive down a winding road devoid of any semblance of civilization, shrouded on both sides by dense forest. It was the only way out of the rural enclave. At my tender age of 18, I was prone to recklessness, fond of overstepping my bounds. On that fateful night, I raced down a lonely road at 80 miles per hour, a fact I later regretted. My only goal was to get home before the clock struck 2 in the morning. It was then, in pitch darkness, that I passed a lone figure trudging along the road. He seemed miles away from civilization, and the frost had undoubtedly chased him to the bone. The Christmas spirit made me stop. I couldn't bear the thought of someone freezing to death on this desolate mountain. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed up to where the stranger was slowly disappearing into the night. Rolling down my window, I asked the man if he needed a ride. His answer took me by surprise. He mumbled a barely audible no and said nothing more. This response was not typical of the hitchhikers I had encountered in the past. Something about him alerted my senses, because he decided to get into my car after all. Silently, he put his bow in the back of my truck and climbed into the passenger seat. As we continued on our way, the awkward silence in the cab became more and more unnerving. I tried to make conversation, to ask if he'd spent Christmas with his family, but the answer was another curt no, followed by an eerie silence. Desperate to break the ice, I kept talking, but my passenger seemed to have become a statue, speechless and emotionless. Minutes stretched in this oppressive silence until he suddenly broke it by asking me to stop at a bend a couple of kilometers ahead. I gingerly followed his request, deciding to park on the side of the road rather than drive into the cul-de-sac. The man remained seated, seemingly deep in thought. Tension hung in the air, the seconds dragging on, turning into an uncomfortable eternity. Finally, he took a stepped out of the car, but left the door ajar. A wave of anxiety swept over me as he stood there, hesitant to take further action. Gathering the last remnants of my courage, I told him not to forget his bow, placing one hand on the steering wheel and reaching to close the door with the other. I turned to him as he bent over to retrieve his weapon. At that moment, he slowly straightened up, his face becoming expressionless, and he looked at me through the window. His eyes looked at me without blinking, as if searching for something deep inside me. My intuition told me something was wrong. Panic surged through my veins, and I made a hasty decision to leave. I didn't wait for him to close the door. The tires squealed, and I sped off, leaving my creepy traveling companion in the dark. When I pulled away from the stop, my heart was racing and a gnawing sense of dread lodged in my stomach. There was a distinct feeling that there was something wrong with this man that defied explanation. There was a van with its door open where I had left it, and the ominous sight sent shivers down my spine. In the years that followed, I never picked up another hitchhiker again. One day, an ordinary family found themselves in an unusual nightmarish situation. On a cool evening, moonlight barely illuminated the winding roads. Grace, a loving wife and mother, sat at home anxiously awaiting the return of her husband John and two young children, Emily and Michael. They had gone on a trip out of town. As the clock struck midnight, Grace couldn't shake the growing anxiety that gripped her. Her mind was swarming with questions, her imagination running wild. Finally, the headlights of the family car emerged from the darkness of the night and urgently pulled into the driveway. Grace rushed to the door and swung it open, her heart racing. John got out of the car, his tired eyes reflecting the strain of the road. He had forced himself to drive late at night, wanting to get home as quickly as possible. The children were sound asleep in the back seat, oblivious to the unfolding drama. Grace's relief at seeing her family safe and sound quickly dissipated when John recounted the disturbing events that had occurred during the night. He recounted how he had overtaken a slow-moving automobile in the early part of the evening, unwittingly showing impatience on the road. The driver of the car, an unknown man in the night, took this as a personal insult and began to tailgate them relentlessly. Not wanting to lead the stranger to their house, John made a quick decision. He turned off the road, hoping to lose the aggressive driver in the winding streets. But to their horror, the stranger continued to pursue them, navigating every turn with uncanny precision. John began to consider his next course of action. With growing unease, he drove to his former place of employment, a small manufacturing plant on the outskirts of town. A sense of relief swept over him when he remembered that the place was guarded by a vigilant security officer, Sam, who was always armed. The pursuing car followed them all the way to the manufacturing complex and stopped. A few meters away from them, John's heart pounded loudly in his chest as he watched the stranger get out of the car, his silhouette remaining in shadow against the dim lighting. It was a tense moment. He could feel the tension in the air. Wasting no time, John rushed inside the building to find Sam, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The stranger followed him without stopping, his face contorted with anger and resentment. Sam, a burly guard, stood at the entrance. He noticed the panic in John's eyes and the stranger following at his heels. Sam quickly stepped between the two men, forming a formidable barrier. He turned to the stranger and demanded, "What's going on here?" The stranger, still seething with rage, pointed an accusing finger at John and began berating him for his aggressive driving, seemingly oblivious to the eerie silence that had settled over the industrial complex. Sam wasn't impressed. His experience as a security guard had honed his instincts. He warned the stranger that he would call the police if he didn't leave immediately. But the stranger was stubborn, unwilling to back down from his self-righteous anger. With no other option, Sam ordered the stranger to stay put until John's family could leave in peace. As they waited, the tension between the two men remained palpable. As John and the children drove away from the industrial complex, they watched in the rearview mirror as the stranger stood by the car, anger still smoldering in his eyes. The relief that swept over them was immense, but questions remained. Who was this man? And why had a simple traffic incident turned into such a terrifying encounter? It was an oppressive summer heat wave in the small, quiet town of Willowbrook. Emily and her younger sister, Lily, decided to make the most of the cool evening and went out to help Lily practice her driving skills. It was around 9 in the evening. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the world had fallen into an eerie twilight. As they drove through the dimly lit city streets, the warm summer air rushed in through the open car windows, creating a sense of freedom and adventure. Their laughter echoed through the night as they sang along to their favorite songs on the radio, and the hum of the engine served as a backdrop to their bonding. The sisters decided to stop at a local gas station before heading home. With a slight hiss, Emily pulled up to the pump and they both got out of the car. It was an ordinary gas station, with fluorescent lights burning overhead and the faint smell of gasoline in the air. They chatted as they filled up, and their mood was elevated and carefree. However, as they were about to finish refueling, something strange happened. From the dark sidewalk beyond the faint light of the gas station came a hoarse voice that pierced the silence of the night. Emily and Lily turned their heads in sync, their faces a mixture of surprise and curiosity. It was a woman, middle-aged by the sound of her voice, but they couldn't make her out. The lack of streetlights in the area shrouded her in darkness, leaving only her silhouette visible. Desperation could be heard in her voice. "Excuse me, Can you help me and give me a ride?" she begged. A shiver ran down Emily's spine as she exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Lily. The situation seemed dire, and her instincts told her to be careful. Still, they were kind-hearted people, always willing to lend a helping hand. "What's wrong?" asked Emily, concern and wariness in her voice. The woman explained her predicament. She had gotten off the bus too early and was now lost in the maze of Willowbrook streets. She was desperate to get to her brother's house, but had no idea where his house was located. Her voice shook with fear as she pleaded for their help. Emily exchanged a glance with Lily, and for a moment they considered helping the woman. After all, she looked genuinely upset, and one could sympathize with a person lost in the dark. But something about the situation didn't sit well with them. "We're sorry," Emily finally said, her tone apologetic, "but we can't help you now. We need to go straight home." The woman continued to plead, her voice growing more desperate. "Please, I'm not a scammer. I just need to get to my brother's house. It's not far from here." Emily and Lily remained firm in their decision, but their instincts told them to be careful. With a heavy heart, Emily turned to the gas station and finished filling up the car. She kept looking over her shoulder, expecting the woman to appear at any moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they were able to turn the car around and drive back towards their home. The gas station and the mystery woman disappeared in the rearview mirror, and Emily breathed a sigh of relief. As they drove away from the gas station, Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. She glanced at Lily, who looked just as worried. "If we gave her a ride," Emily began in a quiet voice, "how would she be able to tell us where her brother lives?" She claimed she didn't even know how to get there. Lily nodded, frowning her eyebrows in thought. "You're right. Something doesn't add up." In the heart of the vast prairie, under a blue sky, lay the town of Meadowbrook. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and where the serenity of rural life was valued. However, this story is not about the town itself, but about a Meadowbrook family, the Thompsons. Jim Thompson, a sturdy and dependable man in his 40s, sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck. Next to him sat his wife Sarah, a soulful woman whose laugh was as infectious as her smile. In the back seat, their 3 children, Lucy, Jake, and Lily, were engaged in the usual bickering between siblings, and that soundtrack of family life filled the air. The sun was beginning to set. The Thompsons were returning home from a day trip to a neighboring town, a rare treat for the family. The trip was uneventful, the speedometer constantly showing the century mark, thanks to the long empty stretch of highway that lay before them. As they were rushing down the highway, a sudden movement caught Jim and Sarah's attention. It was only a fleeting moment, but they saw a man on the side of the road, some distance away from them. The sight was unusual. He wasn't trying to hitchhike, nor was he paying attention to the cars passing by. It seemed to stumble and sway like a brittle reed in the wind. Sarah grabbed Jim's arm, her voice shaking with concern. "Did you see that, Jim? There's a man on the side of the road." Jim's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, searching for that elusive figure they had only seen for a moment. He nodded grimly, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah, I saw him. Looks like he was in trouble." Miles had passed since they'd seen the man, and the sinking feeling in their stomachs grew with each passing minute. They realized they were at least 5 kilometers from the last town they had passed by, and there were no exits or turns on the highway nearby. "We can't just leave him there," Sarah pleaded. Her maternal instincts were at an all-time high. Jim nodded, looking over the horizon for a solution. Finally, they spotted an approaching exit ramp. Without hesitation, Jim honked his horn and pulled onto the exit ramp. The drive to where they had last seen the man seemed endless, especially given the anxious muttering of the children in the back seat. After a seemingly endless 15 minutes of driving, they reached the spot where they had seen the stumbling figure. But now it was nowhere to be seen. Panic and uncertainty gripped them. They decided to act responsibly and called the local police. Jim explained the situation to the dispatcher, his voice strained with excitement. It was getting dark, the temperature was dropping, and it was a chilling reminder of the helplessness of being out in the middle of nowhere. A few minutes later, Officer Mark Foster arrived on the scene. Jim and Sarah recounted their encounter, telling of the strange sight of a man stumbling on the side of the road. Foster listened intently. After making a few notes, he told them, We'll look into the matter. But in these parts, it's not easy to get an exact location in the dark. Go home, put the kids to bed, and I'll call for backup. We'll find out what happened." Jim and Sarah reluctantly returned to the car, all their thoughts occupied with the stranger they had encountered. The drive back to Meadowbrook was a somber one, the atmosphere in the car heavy with unspoken fears. The night was restless, and sleep would not come. The next morning, as the sun rose over the prairie, Jim's cell phone rang. It was Officer Foster. He spoke in a tone that Jim would remember for the rest of his life, a tone that carried the weight of a momentous revelation. "We found this man," Foster said, words of relief and gratitude in his voice. "He was in a diabetic coma, just a few miles from where you saw him last night. He was wandering around in a daze after drinking too much in the town you were passing through." Jim's heart raced as he realized this. "Is he all right?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Foster answered. "His condition has been stabilized thanks to your call. You saved his life, Mr. Thompson." In the heart of the vast Arizona desert, a seemingly ordinary road trip takes an unexpected turn. Mark and Gloria, a middle-aged couple from Albuquerque, find themselves at the center of a terrifying story. Their journey began innocently enough. They were on a road trip through the southwestern United States to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary. The nature-loving couple chose a scenic route through the rugged landscapes of Arizona. They were eager to see all the beauty of the desert, from the iconic saguaro cacti to the breathtaking sunsets that colored the horizon in fiery hues. That evening, the couple drove down the desert highway, the headlights of their trusty SUV making their way through the darkness. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, with only the distant silhouettes of mountain ranges and rock outcroppings keeping them company. As they drove along, immersed in conversation and the enchanting tunes of the playlist they had specially selected for this trip, a sudden disturbance interrupted the tranquility of their journey. In the rearview mirror, Mark saw something disconcerting. A pair of blinding white lights appeared on the horizon, picking up speed. "Gloria, do you see that?" asked Mark, alarm sounding in his voice. Gloria turned and looked at the approaching sight, her eyes widening. It was a huge black Yukon, silhouetted by the dazzling blue and red police headlights mounted on the roof. The car was rapidly approaching them, and the sight sent shivers down her spine. Instinctively, Mark took his foot off the gas pedal and began to pull over to the side of the road. The unaccountable fear that often accompanies the flashing lights of law enforcement came over them, but before they could fully comprehend the situation, Gloria's voice cut through the tension. "Wait, Mark," she said, her tone filled with uncertainty. "Something's not right here." Mark hesitated and looked at his wife with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The Yukon was quite close now, and the eerie glow of police lights illuminated their car. "Keep driving," Gloria said, gripping the armrest tighter. "This doesn't look like a real police car to me." Mark swallowed hard, his gaze darting between the road ahead and the approaching car. He decided to listen to his partner's intuition and continued driving, albeit at a slightly faster pace, as if testing the intentions of the mysterious pursuer. The next 4 minutes seemed like an eternity to him. The black Yukon remained on their tail, its red and blue headlights casting an eerie strobe glow that danced across the desert landscape. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, sweat trickling down his forehead. In the distance they could see a small bend in the road. Mark prayed that around the corner they would find help or a safe place to stop. But just as they approached the bend, something unexpected happened. The Yukon suddenly swerved away from them and accelerated out of sight. Mark breathed a sigh of relief, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. Gloria's tense posture began to relax, and she turned to her husband with a trembling voice. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice shaking. "I think we just narrowly avoided something very dangerous." On a cool pre-dawn morning in early September, the small town of Willowville was plunged into a sleepy silence. The streets were deserted, with only a faint orange glow on the horizon hinting at the approaching dawn. John Mitchell, a lanky 17-year-old with a passion for fitness, was already awake and behind the wheel of his trusty sedan, ready to begin his daily ritual. John had developed a disciplined habit of driving to the gym at the crack of dawn before school. His commitment to fitness was unwavering, and he prided himself on the solitude of these morning workouts. This morning, however, his solitude was disrupted. Pulling up to the stoplight at the intersection of Elm Street and Oak Avenue, John glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 4:30 a.m. The world outside the car window was plunged into darkness, and the only source of illumination was the intermittent streetlights casting eerie shadows. Just as John sank into his thoughts, contemplating the day ahead, his attention was abruptly drawn to the crosswalk in front of him. 3 figures appeared out of the impenetrable darkness, moving in a strange coordination. John's heartbeat quickened, and he squinted to get a better look at them. To his surprise and disbelief, the figures were dressed as clowns. Their oversized, multicolored costumes were decorated with fanciful patterns, and their faces hid white masks with exaggerated smiles. Each clown had a red bulbous nose that seemed to glow eerily in the dim light. One of them held a bundle of balloons that bobbed ominously in the morning silence. John's thoughts raced as he tried to make sense of the surreal sight before him. He couldn't help but remember that there had been stories circulating in the media lately about the clown trend, a strange fad where people dressed as clowns participated in bizarre, often threatening activities. While most were relatively harmless pranksters, there were disturbing reports of crimes committed by these self-styled clowns. Panic rose in John's chest. He knew he was alone at this hour, with no witnesses and nowhere to wait for help. The clowns had already approached the crosswalk, and their painted eyes seemed to sink into him. For a moment there was a chilling silence in the air, broken only by the slight hum of the idling engine. Instinct took over. Without thinking, John pressed the gas pedal, ignoring the red light. The engine roared, and the car sped forward, tires screeching as it sped through the intersection. He took one last look in the rearview mirror, watching the clowns fade into the darkness, their bizarre figures disappearing. His heart pounded in his chest and he continued driving, trying to distance himself as much as possible from this disturbing encounter. He hesitated to look back. Questions and doubts swarmed in his mind. What did these clowns want? Were they just jokers or something more dangerous? As he sat there, he couldn't help but think about what would have happened if he had remained standing at the stoplight waiting for the clowns to approach his car. Would they have continued their bizarre antics? Or was there some dark agenda behind their creepy presence? The stories he had heard about the crimes committed by the clowns kept him on his toes. It was a dark, moonless night in the quiet suburban town of Elmwood. Sarah and her sister Emily were enjoying a rare evening together. They were driving down Elm Street, just a few blocks from their family home. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional flickering streetlight lighting their way. Their laughter filled the car as they shared stories and experiences from the previous evening. As they pulled up to a dimly lit intersection, Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter. Something was wrong. A strange sense of unease lingered in the air. Emily fell silent as well, her eyes scanning the shadows that played with her vision. And then, as if out of nowhere, it happened. A child no older than 8, with disheveled hair and tattered clothes, rushed in front of the car. Sarah and Emily screamed in horror, and Sarah instinctively hit the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest. But it was too late. The baby was right in front of them. Sarah braced herself for the terrifying collision. Thoughts of a future clouded by the tragic accident she was about to cause flashed through her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the sound, the rumble, the indescribable horror that was about to erupt. But nothing. Silence. The car came to a stop, and Sarah cautiously opened her eyes. She blinked confusedly. The baby was gone. Neither was the impact. There was nothing in front of them but an empty, dimly lit street. Tears welled up in their eyes as they stared at each other, overwhelmed by fear and confusion. What just happened? Emily whispered Emily, her voice shaking. Sarah's hands shook as she turned off the engine and they got out of the car. They searched the neighborhood with flashlights, but the mysterious child was nowhere to be seen. The eerie silence of the night seemed to press in on them, and the sisters couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. What was that? Muttered Emily, her voice trembling with fear. I don't know, replied Sarah, her thoughts racing. I really don't know. It's like he just disappeared. They returned to the car, both immersed in their thoughts. The ride home passed in tense silence. Sarah's hands were still shaking, and her thoughts were consumed by the horrifying image of the child running in front of the car. The action is set in the small town of Crescentville, located in the heart of the Midwest. It is a quiet and unassuming place. And for Jake Mitchell, a resident of Crescentville, life was about to take an unexpected turn. Jake had always been a night owl. He worked the late shift at a local factory, and his long workday ended somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. He was a night owl. Despite the unconventional schedule, he was content with his routine until he met Emily, a woman who changed his life in ways he never imagined. Emily was a free spirit, passionate about music and always looking for new adventures. Their love quickly blossomed. They had common interests and undeniable chemistry. But there was one peculiarity in Emily's life that Jake couldn't understand: her fear of driving, especially on the highway. She had a phobia that she carefully hid, and Jake respected her desire, never pushing her to do so. One day, Jake took a bold step. He took time off work, knowing that Emily's favorite band was performing in a town 2 hours away. He wanted to surprise her and give her an unforgettable experience. That night, as they lay in bed, Jake whispered in her ear, "I have a surprise for you tomorrow." The next morning, Emily woke Jake up at the ungodly hour of 7 in the morning. She wanted to get to the concert venue early, insisting that they should be first in line, front and center. Jake, still reeling from the late shift, was reluctant but willing to go along with her plan. But there was a catch. He was hoping to sleep a few hours in the car while Emily took their place in line. When they pulled up to the venue, their car was the only one in the parking lot. The staff hadn't arrived yet. Emily was angry at Jake for wanting a break, and he reluctantly joined her on the cold curb. Hours passed, the sun gradually creeping across the sky, casting long shadows, but no one else appeared in line. It was a strange sight, Jake and Emily alone together in the early morning hours. Finally, nearing noon, people began to trickle in behind them. The excitement in the air became more and more palpable as the hours passed. Jake couldn't help but feel annoyed. He could have been well rested by now, but he kept his thoughts to himself, not wanting to upset Emily any further. The show was everything Emily had hoped for: the music, the lights, the energy of the crowd. As they began to head home, however, fatigue began to take its toll. He hadn't slept in almost 24 hours, and it was beginning to affect his perception of reality. Desperate for rest, Jake asked Emily to drive. He explained how tired he was and how hard it was for him to concentrate. But Emily, stubborn as ever, refused to drive. Sighing, Jake took over driving. The road stretched out before them, endless and treacherous. Jake's eyelids grew heavy, and his consciousness began to play a game of whack-a-mole with him. The clouds on the horizon seemed to turn into transportation, and his tired brain struggled to distinguish reality from hallucination. He fixated on one cloud, deciding it was a huge truck blocking his path. In a panic, he tried to figure out why he couldn't drive past it. At that moment, he realized the seriousness of his condition. He was hallucinating. Jake tried to regain control of his mental state, trying to keep his mind on the road. The trip became an ordeal as he struggled with fatigue and the surreal visions that haunted him. Emily stubbornly remained in her seat, refusing to help. Jake somehow miraculously managed to get them home safely, driving with caution and relying on his own determination. As soon as they arrived, he collapsed into bed and fatigue came over him like a tidal wave. Many years ago, in a quiet northeast corner of the UK, I immersed myself in the world of IT, working in support services for various nuclear power stations. My job mainly involved managing office and desktop systems and supporting servers. It wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it did pay the bills. One night while serving in the Northeast, I got an unexpected call that set me on a journey I'll never forget. It was late, well past midnight, and I was on duty at several stations across the country. The call came from Heysham, a coastal town on the opposite side of the country. They had a critical service failure and the servers were completely unresponsive. It was one of those moments when you realize that a dream is a distant dream. Sighing heavily, I packed up my equipment and set off for Heysham. The drive was long and the hours were lonely. Due to the remote location of the factory, I had to drive through the countryside, including some very desolate roads over the moors. There was nothing but the dim light of headlights in the darkness. There was a sense of total isolation and the feeling that I was in the middle of nowhere. As I drove through these creepy swamp roads at 3 in the morning, I was overcome with fatigue. And that's when it happened, a faint flicker, something in the corner of my eye. At first I dismissed it, thinking it was a trick of the eye, the result of my fatigue. But then it appeared again, this time more clearly a pair of small glowing lights to my right. They appeared and disappeared, as if playing hide and seek with my senses. Curiosity turned to anxiety when a few more mysterious lights joined the dance. There were about 8 of them now, these eerie greenish spheres moving erratically. They seemed to float in the air, their movements deliberate and almost purposeful. They seemed to be approaching the road, and my heartbeat quickened. As the lights drew nearer, I could not escape the thought that I might be on the threshold of a truly outlandish encounter. I chuckled at the absurdity of it all, but I couldn't ignore the growing feeling of dread in my stomach. The lights that had once been mere specks in the distance were now alarmingly close. They swayed and floated, casting eerie green reflections on the road ahead. I unconsciously slowed down and gripped the steering wheel as if my life depended on it. Fear covered me with a heavy cloak, and my imagination ran wild. Just as my anxiety peaked, it happened, a moment of surreal clarity that was both absurd and soothing. For figures, shrouded in darkness, ran across the road in front of me. My headlights illuminated their eyes, creating the illusion of glowing orbs. But they were actually for sheep who, frightened by the approaching car, were trying to take cover on the other side of the road.